Anyway, if we are going to get going, and it's fantastic to have Noelene from Fiji over there, and to have anyone who's listening in online, very, very warm welcome to this, what they call a hybrid event. But it's ironic, isn't it? Because here we are in Wellington, grappling with the effects of flooding right here. And then at the same time, we have Pacific leaders gathering in Tonga to discuss the devastating impact of climate change in the Pacific. And then we have world leaders preparing for the upcoming World Conference on Climate Change in Azerbaijan on November the 11th, called COP29. So it's incredibly timely to take stock and reflect on why, despite, we've got years of record heats and floods all over the planet, and you would think that there would be such an incredible feeling of urgency on this issue, and yet we find that the momentum for climate change action seems to have stalled. So we will be looking at that issue, and what can we expect from this next World Climate Change Conference, COP29, and how can we ensure that women are at the table at the COP summit and wherever climate change is addressed. Just before I start, I want to quote from a recently released report from the Club of Rome. It points out that the climate change crisis will affect everyone on Earth for generations to come and will spell greater insecurity for all. Yet, it points out, there is at present no plan of action to resolve it, no credible path forward to achieve net carbon zero by 2050. There's a universal failure of leadership and governance to address the crisis, and a lack of awareness among governments and ordinary citizens about the scale of the looming crisis and what to do about it. And young people, and women especially, have been excluded to a large extent from the decision-making and leadership needed to address the climate emergency. So it's incredibly, we're very fortunate tonight to have this opportunity to hear from 4 women, all of whom are leaders in climate change action, who are going to talk about what they think needs to be done to address the crisis and what we can expect from this forthcoming global conference. First off, we have Dr. Gill Greer, long-time champion of gender equality and human rights, the former chief executive of the Volunteer Service Abroad, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, and the National Council of Women of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Jacqui Ruesga manages the International Carbon Market team at the Ministry for the Environment. She's one of our lead negotiators of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Welcome. Jessica Palairet, she's the Executive Director of Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand, an organisation that uses the law to encourage more effective action on climate change. In Fiji, we have Noelene Nabulivou, and she's a Fijian activist, spokesperson on climate change and gender equality, the Executive Director for Diverse Voices and Action for Equality in Fiji, an organisation that promotes climate justice and reducing violence against women. And last but by no means least, Chlöe Swarbrick, co-leader of the Green Party, MP for Auckland Central, the Green Party's climate change spokesperson, and I might add, the 3rd most popular politician in New Zealand. And they're all going to speak, each of them are going to speak for 5 minutes, and then we will have questions. I'll ask them a question or so each. Chlöe first, because she has to leave. Then it'll be open so you can think of questions from the floor. So without further ado, our first speaker is Dr. Gill Greer, a gender equality and human rights activist. Speak with this. Yes. Bill has an extraordinary amount of books here.
Ex-teachers can never resist it. And thank you, and wonderful to see you all. Thank you, Sue. And lovely to see my fellow panelists. That's great. Climate change is the defining issue of the 21st century. In the run-up to COP, countries have important commitments to cut greenhouse gas emissions, scale up adaptation to climate change. But more needs to be done. As many have noted, the world is recklessly late in agreeing to take action. The stakes are high. Climate change is causing tens of thousands of deaths every year. Implementing and enforcing higher standards for vehicle emissions and engine efficiency can reduce emissions of short-lived climate pollutants. A ruined planet cannot sustain human lives in good health. That's a nice opening to a speech, but it's not mine. The speech was actually made by a remarkable woman, Dr. Margaret Chan, who was head of the World Health Organization and who I watched cry in front of the whole World Health Assembly on the issue of climate change. And she made that speech 11 years ago. And I ask you, what has changed? Not enough, not nearly enough. As Ban Ki-moon said, we are the first generation in history to have the power to end poverty. And we have made progress. And we are also the last generation to have the power to prevent climate change. And when my grandson a couple of years ago was making a speech about climate change at school, largely due to my influence on my son and the rest of the family, he finished up after saying, could you live in a world without koala bear, without this, without that? We have to do better than our parents have done. And I said to him, he was about 11 at the time, I said, Tom, could I add to that? Because I would really like to borrow some of it for my last BSA bulletin. He said, of course, Jill. And he looked at me and said, what do you want to add? I said, we have to do better than our parents have done and our grandparents have done. And we jointly, as generations, are responsible. And are we too late? It's ironic today, at a time when we have more capacity than ever before to connect and collaborate, that we seem to be more divided than ever. Those who do not believe in climate change, those who do not want to address climate change, even if they do believe in it. We can do the best we can, adapt, mitigate, ameliorate, change our lifestyles. I've driven a beaten up old Prius since 2011. Now passed over to someone in this room and hopefully it will survive, or she will survive. We can do our best to meet the vision of the Sustainable Development Goals. These were created with Helen Clark's leadership to change the world, to make us work together, government and NGOs, young and old, to make us see that there were 15 issues that are all connected. Most of us learn about one. Most of us care about one. But instead, we need to care about them all. And that includes human rights. And I don't think we've heard enough around human rights and the issues of climate change, which will deprive humans of health, of food, of almost everything you can think of. But as you can see from this, there's quite a bit we can use. I'm just waiting for the time. And some of you might like to join me in that little battle. Too often, we are led by governments who completely reverse what the preceding government has done. I think we've all seen that quite recently. Yep. And we can see business leaders who know the facts, but don't change the practice. What's driving that? Money? Profit? I don't know. I don't get to talk to many of them. The need for collaborative, collective action is urgent at every level, and nothing else will do. And women have a critical role to play, and so do men, but that's always been taken for granted. We are all concerned citizens, parents, leaders, champions, negotiators. We've known for years that climate change drives environmental degradation, diminishes resources for our families, creates food crises, forces displacement, and brings terrifying extreme weather events. We know all too well that it's a major threat to human well-being and sustainable development, hence the Sustainable Development Goals, especially the poor and the most marginalized, that it exacerbates inequity and poverty. We have seen fires burning beyond our wildest imagination in the Northern Hemisphere in their summer, and Australian families before that. And here, Cyclone Gabrielle, I believe that the people who lived through that still wake at night when it rains and lie in fear. The impact continues as the heat rises, impacting on health, agriculture, water supplies, now threatening the Arctic and the Antarctic. That is extraordinary and incredibly dangerous for us. And yet we know that climate drives as well environmental degradation, diminishes resources. So why are we surprised at all of these? And we know too that it affects the poor and the most marginalized. As one Australian said, a woman, we need to learn to live, love, learn, and legislate. We have not legislated enough. We need to recognize the critical need for good governance, the additional responsibilities it places on people in governance, including government. We need true international, regional, and local cooperation. But too often, we unbuild the existing alliances. NGOs play very well together when we get money. When we have no money, it's competition. My issue matters more. What happens to the Sustainable Development Goals then? Is it agriculture or is it health? And so it goes on. I hope that some of you might be interested in joining us in the next edition we do of the Sustainable Development Goals and in writing the report, which we will be beginning very soon. This was 2019's. And it gives us a better vision and some wonderful stories of what New Zealanders are currently doing. But the Auditor General was not happy with government, and he's still waiting for this government's report, and they will be expected to report last year. And we now have a climate rapporteur, a woman. So a whole part of the UN devoted to that. And you all know how important collaborative effort is. And alongside that, we need, I think it's a wonderful concept, intelligent rage. There's a few of us who are forming a non-partisan group with the hope of addressing climate change in a variety of ways. And I would love to hear from you if you're interested, as well as encouraging young people. There are so many of us who have so much to give, and we need to remind others of the promises made in the past for the future. So thank you very much for listening to me. Kia kaha, kia manawa nui.
Hold on.
And our next speaker is Jacqui Ruesga from the Ministry for the Environment.
Thank you, Sue. Kia ora koutou katoa. As introduced, I am Jacqui Ruesga. I work for the Ministry for the Environment in the Climate Change Mitigation and Resource Efficiency Business Unit. I'm currently the manager of the International Markets team and New Zealand's lead negotiator for Article 6 under the Paris Agreement, which is where we're developing the rules for international carbon markets. So my aim for this kōrero is to share and to speak to the role of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, and the multilateral system that underpins international climate action. I want to emphasize the role that New Zealand plays in upholding the multilateralism and even in shaping it. With a global challenge like climate change, it is important to remember and recognize that it does require global action. New Zealand contributes approximately 0.15% of gross global emissions. We're clearly not a major emitter. However, the impacts of climate change are not distributed based on the share of emissions. New Zealand and our Pacific neighbors are very susceptible to the impacts of climate change, and we see this and live this now all the time. So for us to keep the global temperature goal of 1.5 Celsius alive and avoid the worst impacts of climate change, it is important that we support and drive action by others, especially those heavy emitters. And it's through the multilateral system that we do this, by holding each other to account. So just last year, the outcomes of the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement, a process that will now take place every 5 years, found that prior to the agreement, the world was on track for a 4-degree temperature increase. But now with the agreement that has near universal buy-in, we're actually on track for 2.1 to 2.8 degrees of temperature rise. That's if all countries and their climate actually implement their climate commitments. So we still have a ways to go there. So New Zealand has an important role to play in showing up to the UNFCCC process and supporting its success. We bring our unique context and ensure that the outcomes are aligned with national priorities and objectives and that they work for Kiwis. Similarly, we bring home the best practices, the lessons learned, and the cooperation with other countries to ensure that our domestic actions are also making meaningful contributions to the global effort. I just want to give one quick example of how we do this. In June, at the Bonn Intersessional of the UNFCCC negotiations, New Zealand underwent what's called a multilateral assessment. This is a review of our reporting under the UNFCCC. And what we do is we present on the findings of our report, how we've been tracking towards our progress, and then other countries get an opportunity to ask us questions. What are you doing? What are you working on? What was successful? What wasn't? Can you explain this in more detail? So I had the privilege of fronting that presentation and spoke to the United Nations and shared New Zealand's experience under our previous target. And I sat in the room as other countries also underwent this assessment, and they got 2 questions, 3 questions, 4 questions. New Zealand got 12 questions. It was one of the highest number in that session of countries being asked. What it really sends home to me is that people are curious about what New Zealand is doing. There is high interest in New Zealand's climate action. I really want to emphasize that even though we are a small country at the bottom of the South Pacific, we can still make a difference in international climate action. We can still be influential and advocate for outcomes that make sense at home and abroad. So I'm really looking forward to sharing more about how we do this, how New Zealand shows up internationally, including at the upcoming COP29 that our moderator mentioned in Baku, Azerbaijan, and to hearing the rest of the panel on their own experiences working in climate change, because there's a really great diversity of perspectives here. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And now we have Jessica Palairet, I hope I'm not mispronouncing it, Palairet, and she's representing Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's such a privilege to be here as a woman at the table working on climate change. I've been Lawyers for Climate Action's Executive Director now for the last 9 months. And a question I often get is, well, why the law? What have lawyers got to do with all of this? I think lawyers don't always have the best reputations to start off with. But the law is actually one of the most important tools that we have in responding to the climate crisis. Because climate crisis, at its heart, it's a systemic issue that requires systems level change. And the legal system is one of the most important and powerful systemic levers that we have. So what we do at Lawyers for Climate Action, we've been doing this now for 5 years. We founded in 2019. We're a community of lawyers across the country using the law to enable more effective action on climate change. We've got a network of over 370 members now across the country. Everyone other than me is a volunteer. And so volunteering their time, be it through litigation, policy, advocacy work, writing submissions, providing pro bono legal muscle to community climate action so that community climate groups can have access to pro bono lawyers to support them in their activism. That's the kind of work that we do. And I really do think that it makes a difference. And so where does the law really come to bite? Why does it matter? Well, I would say 2 things about that. So the first is that in order to address the climate crisis, we need the right laws in place in the first time. And so I was interested, Jill, when you're talking about human rights, we've been advocating, it's one of the first things that we did when we started as an organisation, is advocate for New Zealand to introduce the right to a sustainable and healthy environment in our Bill of Rights Act. That's an example of when you have the legal settings right, when we accept as a society what our legal norms are, that makes a really big difference. It would mean that all decision makers have to be consistent with that right. you have to question whether things like fast track approvals would be consistent with that, right? It would be a really powerful lever for change. But even once you have the right laws in place, laws are just words on a page unless they're actually enforced and unless we actually hold people accountable. And that's really the other part of work that we do at Lawyers for Climate Action. We go to court, we litigate, we write grumpy letters to decision makers and say, hey, remember your legal obligations because they matter. And there's a bunch of examples when we've done that. So we successfully fought legal proceedings against the former Minister for Climate Change, but really the Cabinet, for not following the Climate Change Commission's advice in relation to ETS settings. We've currently got a case against Z Energy. It's New Zealand's first ever greenwashing proceeding, arguing that Z Energy had an advertising campaign saying, we're in the business of getting out of the petrol business, but they're actually in the business of selling petrol. And we're telling shareholders they were wanting to continue and increase their sales of petrol, all the while we say misleading consumers. Again, we already have fair trading laws in New Zealand, but unless you actually bring accountability and enforce those laws, they don't mean a whole heap. And that's where Lawyers for Climate Action does a lot of its work. So we're looking quite carefully at the laws and legal frameworks in New Zealand at the moment and asking, are they actually being enforced and are people being held accountable? We're looking at the NDC and going, well, is the government actually intending to meet the NDC or just telling everyone, yeah, we're going to meet it, but not actually budgeting for that and putting money aside in order to pay and make it happen? We've got obligations, or the minister has obligations to set emissions reduction plans that will enable emissions budgets to be met. Well, will emissions reduction plans actually enable that to happen? Do the numbers add up? Are the assumptions credible? And are we taking a really unnecessarily high risk approach there? We're also really concerned generally about the government using complicated math to make us seem like we're doing a better job than we are. And that's the basis for an ongoing challenge we've got against the Climate Change Commission and Climate Change Commission and Minister for Climate Change on that part as well. So I think the law matters an awful lot. And I encourage any lawyers in the room to come join Lawyers for Climate Action, but also to not discount the role of the law and actually pushing for better legal change and better accountability across the system. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, our next speaker is in Fiji, Noelene Nabulivou, a Fijian climate change activist coming to us by Zoom. And I know that, Noelene, you've been campaigning on these issues for well over a decade. So we're delighted to have you here by Zoom tonight.
Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just a confirmation. Yes, great. Bulavinaka, I'm Noelene Nabulivou. I live in Nandi in Fiji. I'm from the Nanu clan in Dravalu, Natheva in Kandavus, and that's the southernmost marine island group in Fiji, closest to Aotearoa, New Zealand. My father's people are Indigenous Fijian. My mother's are settlers on First Nations land in Australia, and I work every day with thousands of Pacific women in many, many networks on every aspect of women's lives. We know they're all linked, obviously, and our communities. I and my organization are in solidarity with all Indigenous people, and I pay respect to the Maori people, to Pacifica and Pacific Indigenous peoples working for sovereignty and self-determination, and believe in historical responsibility and common but differentiated responsibility. So I'm the executive director of Diva for Equality, and we've been going since 2011, but my work goes back. I'm 56 years old, and I've been doing this since I was 16 years old. So I think around 40 years now. We organize on issues of gender and sexuality across, social, economic, ecological, and climate justice. And we've been really amping up the work on the issue of ecocide and planetary disruption and how that manifests in all kinds of ways in people's lives across the Pacific and across the world, including there in New Zealand. We started to mobilize in 2014, I'd say, with a greater fierceness, because we got quite tired of hearing about work of women and climate, but then seeing really overly technical solutions and women not really being substantively acknowledged as experts in the work that we were doing in all kinds of ways. So here we are, 10 years on or more today, and we've done a lot, but nowhere near enough. And that's why we're here together in this room, I think. So in this limited time, maybe I wanted to start just being clearer on the ask in this title. It's a great title, and to widen and deepen it. Because I'm a feminist woman from the majority world. I'm a brown lesbian in highly patriarchal, heteropatriarchal imperial spaces, and I choose never to hide. And so we pay prices for that in our whole bodies. And for me, that's well worth it, but we know very well the histories of our places and of other places and the bodies and how we carry all of this pain and trauma and the joy of organizing for a different kind of world. And so one of the first things that we have to start on, obviously, has to be around issues of bodily autonomy and integrity, the right to have territory over my own body, and unceded indigenous territories around the world. So we always start with that claim. And I don't want just to see more women at the climate table. I'm sure you're the same. I want a new kind of table in a new room, in a newly designed space, in a differently designed community. And we need this free, balanced, and just living planet, because we know that this work is urgent. And we also have to then think about all of the genders that we see at any table on climate change, not just conservative women, not patriarchal women, not white women, I have to say, as not without Black, brown, indigenous, ethnic minorities, women with disabilities, lesbian, bisexual, trans women, and gender non-binary people. We want to see girls and boys, elders, women throughout our life courses, and from urban, poor, rural, and maritime areas and more. And for me, I want to see feminists who are fighting for justice in those climate spaces, including all of us that work for universal justice and human rights. So to do that, we need at least the following. That's why it's imperative to have these spaces to talk frankly and openly with each other, but two, so that we can strategize, that we can keep forming coalitions and social movements, because it's so urgent. So the first thing is we have to know the state of the ecocide, that we're now so close to the 1.5 guardrail. And no matter our pushes, it's still not enough. The emissions are going up. The Earth's still heating. 1 million species are under threat. We've got 200 species a day going extinct. 90% of the reefs in the world are under threat. And all of the ecosystems that we require so much for so many reasons. We have to know the urgency of the context and conditions as Pacific women, New Zealand women, women in all of our different spaces. We are so much in solidarity with the women in Afghanistan and in West Papua and in New Caledonia, Kanaki, because those individual struggles are collective struggles that are about the connection between heteropatriarchy and between all of the colonial experiences, but also coloniality that remains today. So we know that just this June, 5 billion people around the planet suffered from heat exposure. We know also that wherever we work, including, those thousands of women that I work with all the time, we require a nexus approach, because these governments of ours, they still work in silos, and those silos are not possible. We need to be not frantic, but we need to be very clear on the amount of work, the layered work that is there for women who are working on climate change, the intersectional, interlinked, and embodied nature of both the pain that we suffer, the loss and damage, but also of the leadership and the responses that we show. Because the ILO has said very clearly in 2018 that 80% of the unpaid work is done by women in Asia and the Pacific. We already know that in our bodies in the Pacific, and you can speak more clearly to me on this from New Zealand, but we are double the rates of global of violence against women in the Pacific. We have 30 to 50% of unmet contraceptive needs in our region. So with all of these things that we're working on as women every day, of course, we must be not just in the middle of the solutions, but people must be clear on the interlinked nature of social, economic, ecological, and climate justice. Because we already know very clearly that climate change is a symptom of ecocide. There are all kinds of practices that we need to stop. Bottom trawling, factory fishing, open pen aquaculture, extraction of 45% of the biomass of the entire human species is every year. The IPCC already has told us this. Plastic pollution is set to triple in the next 3 decades. We're killing ocean micro and macro flora and fauna, and we know we're doing it. But this cognitive dissonance that we see, where we can both pretend to keep doing business as usual and also work towards a different kind of reality where 7 generations of children after us can see a future for themselves. And thank you, to the opening speaker for your work on this. I have a beautiful 6-year-old that I think about every day, about how we are going to make sure that all of our social systems work so that she and every other girl on the planet are not just dealing with all of the issues that we do every day, socially and economically, but that ecologically and in terms of climate, that we have done everything that we can. And that's why we have to move away from false solutions. We know that we are seeing, our governments are meeting right now in Tonga, and the level of discussion is nowhere near where it needs to be. And that's because they are worried most, to be honest, about the finance. They are dealing with issues of non-payment. They are dealing with historic injustices, of geopolitics at play. And we have to be able to talk about those openly and honestly and work out how, as small island societies in the Pacific, we are truly moving towards something different, because civilizational shifts are necessary now. And for those who are reluctant to change or who are obstacles to needed change, we have to change that now. And I believe that it is feminists and it is women that have always been the ones who push and who move. We've been there in the fight, for instance, on recognition of loss and damage. And then we get it into the text finally in Cairo. And what happens? We have the World Bank who is hosting it now. 18% of the funds that goes into that will be going to the World Bank. Will they really let it go after 4 years? I hope so, because that was not what we fought for 40 years, 30 years within the UNFCCC. And I wanted to just say that for every additional decimal point above 1.5% of global warming, that means that adaptation becomes costlier by at least 15%. So we have to talk about funds, but not only that. There is so much loss and damage that is non-economic. How do you cost what is happening across the Pacific, not just in terms of the material and economic problems that we're facing because of climate change, but when our ancestors' graves are becoming lost in the waters around our homes, where we are starting to see salinity, so much salinity in our water that a lot of Diva's work now has to pivot completely, because we have to work on issues of water and housing and basic needs, things that we thought we had managed to move at least, so that we are in a positive trajectory. But we are now seeing some of the regression happen. So overall, yes, it's shocking where we are right now, and it's not good to be the one who always has to raise this. But when you think about how we are going, we need to be in the stuff of loving and fierce revolutions. And feminists and women in New Zealand, in Fiji, in RMI, in West Papua, in Sudan, in Haiti, in all of these places, we will be the ones who make the change. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very powerful presentation. And now we have Chlöe Swarbrick.
Kia ora iho, so much that could be said. I'll try and keep this as brief as possible so we can get into some kōrero. So yeah, I've been doing this politics thing now for 7 years, and I have spent so many of those years trying to figure out how to communicate the intensity and the urgency and the evidence around climate change, and why it is so imperative that all of us work collectively in order to, improve the world. Crazy. And what was wild about that experience is that at the start of last year, all of that kind of academic exercise fell away, and I was with fellow Aucklanders ripping up people's carpets and curtains and livelihoods from their home as our city was completely flooded. And I just was completely lost for words. And as I think we all kind of know, in moments of urgency and emergency like that, everybody rallies around and we just help our neighbours. There's no artificial means testing or determination of who is deserving. And I think the real challenge for all of us is trying to figure out how to take what we do in emergencies and in those times of crises into those slower moving crises where we do need that level of cooperation at a scale unlike we have ever seen before. Just to offer some reflections on some of the points that have been raised around particularly human rights. When we're talking about human rights, we're not talking about some new age wokeness like this. You know, if you go back decades in the wake of world wars, you know, the advent of the United Nations was to effectively say, how do we prevent conflict from ever getting that bad ever again? So we came together and determined that there were some really critical things that all of us needed and were necessary for coherent and stable societies. And actually, to the point around putting into the Bill of Rights Act 1990 a right to a sustainable environment, Greens actually tried that just this term. Unfortunately, it was voted down in our parliament. It was one of the last actions of the Honourable James Shaw. I want to thread that, though, through into some of the whakaaro that was laid down just before about the intersectionality of all of these rights, and particularly the notion of justice. And actually to bring this back to the way that politicians so frequently talk about the economy. It was Jeanette Fitzsimons who said that we have an economy that currently exploits both people and the planet. And obviously from the kaupapa that I come from, we'd really love to invert that. But this is kind of a challenge to all of you. Whenever you have a politician in front of you who is talking about the economy, ask them to define what the hell it is that they are talking about. What I am talking about when I talk about the economy is all of us, the stuff that we create, the planet that we live on, and the rules that we put in place in order to, I don't know, govern those relationships and the kind of outcomes that we want from each other. Unfortunately, what I think has happened in my lifetime, I'm just turned 30, is that we have conflated the economy with the notion of GDP. GDP, for the uninitiated, invented in the 1930s by a guy called Simon Kuznets, took it to the US Congress. It was like, hey guys, here's a really good way to measure economic transactions inside of society, but God forbid, I'm paraphrasing, do not use this as a measure of what he called welfare and we now call well-being. The reason for that is that GDP goes up when someone is in a car crash, when someone gets cancer, when there is a natural disaster, because there has to be economic transactions in order to undo that social ill. And for those who remember the North Island weather events, Treasury actually predicted off the back of the May 2023 budget that we would avoid, unfortunately they were wrong, but a technical recession because of the amount of expenditure that was necessary just to put the same damn infrastructure back in place. This is the fallacy of the economic model that we presently use. And I guess, sorry, I've been rambling for ages, but I've got 2 minutes left. Another point that I just want to make is that actually, I know that we all like to talk about, and you know, I see it frequently happening in the House where politicians will stand up in really grandiose gestures and talk about how they want things to not be political. It's bullshit. It's all political, guys. What is happening right now has to be called out, and it is from a political and from an ideological standpoint. We are all human beings. We all have ideas and ideologies and values. And the question for us is whether we are willing to be explicit about that. So how I kind of tend to think about how we do the social change thing is in two broad spheres. There's the structural and there's the cultural. The structural is the laws, the legislation, regulation, funding, taxation, incentives, subsidies, contracts, procurement, the framework or the blueprint, the kind of social contract in black and white. But that stuff gets its legitimacy from and can be delegitimized by culture. And I'm not talking about culture here as synonymous with someone's ethnicity or geographical background or religious practice. I'm talking about culture from a design thinking perspective, which is defined as a shared set of values. That cannot be repeated enough. Culture defined as a shared set of values. So when we are talking about how we can congregate around and create the structural change by creating the environment conducive to that structural change, by having more explicit and intentional conversations about the values that we want governing us, then we're in a far more productive and constructive space than I think we are at the moment. Which takes me to that point around kind of the polarization that we were talking about before. Honestly, and frankly, especially after sitting in the chamber in question time today, I am increasingly, as I think probably a lot of people are, losing a lot of hope with the institution of our parliament as it is presently presented to us. But where I find my hope and my inspiration is in our communities. So that is the organizing that we have to do. We have to genuinely, as communities, figure out how to take back that power that I think the current feedback loop of disengagement and disconnection is creating. Politics belongs to those who turn up, and it's actually not that complicated, despite all of the gatekeeping jargon that is frequently thrown out in order to guard people's engagement with it. Just to round up, because I will have to run away and apologize for that in a few moments, but I'd just like to leave you with two of my favorite quotes, which I think really kind of bring all of this together. One is Mark Fisher's, which is that, unfortunately, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I think that that bleeds quite well into Ursula Le Guin's quote, "We live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable, but then so too did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begins in art. Very often in our arts, the art of words." Kia ora.
Well, Chloe, we can, I think all of us can empathise with your despair of our political system.
Community, it's just not in parliament.
But actually, I remember once being asked when I was in Parliament about what were the obstacles to climate change. And I said, well, one of them is democracy, because our democracy, apart from all the polarisation that Chloe's talking about, it's focused on 3 years and on winning votes every 3. Climate change requires long-term thinking and cross-party consensus.
Absolutely.
Now, climate change is, I know you don't want to particularly talk politics, Chloe, but it's fallen off the political agenda. I mean, in the UK elections, it was noticeably absent. The Democratic Convention, I don't think I barely got a mention there, not to mention in our existing Parliament. So, Chloe, and then we'll ask, because Chloe has to leave, if some of you have 1 or 2 questions, how are we going to get it back on the agenda here? Oh, good, you got it. And how do we get a cross-party consensus on, or is it impossible? I mean, I know James.
I don't think it's possible.
James slogged away to get the Climate Change Commission to get a cross-party agreement. And that's, I think, one of the only things that the present government has not dismantled. So that is an example there was of cross-party consensus. Can we expand on that, or is that hopeless?
Yeah, so a few different reflections. The first one would be, and guys, I'm feeling very flippant tonight, so is that I was having a conversation with somebody who used to be pretty high up in the National Party, who will remain nameless, and I was asking them about how I could approach trying to drive towards some form of kind of consensus on this stuff, because it is so critical and we cannot wait any more years. And this person said to me quite straight up, I'm sorry, but it was probably way easier for you to work with the National Party when they were in opposition than when they're in power. I'll leave it to you guys to read into whatever you can take from that. I think that the fundamental problem that we have at the moment is that the incentive structure inside of our institution of Parliament is wrong. The Westminster colonial system effectively says, you know, again, with the legacy of first past the post in particular, that you're going to have a red team and a blue team leading the government, and they're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater depending on whoever's in charge. That incentive structure of effectively antagonism and getting one up on each other, especially on a day-to-day basis inside of the news cycle that we work with, is not an incentive structure to, I don't know, solve the problems of our time. If you were to design a system that was capable, let alone competent, of dealing with the issues of our time, you would not design our parliament. So that's why I think that we have to see all of this stuff as so deeply interconnected to actually also upholding Te Tiriti o Waitangi, also to that to that economic justice point as well. And I find it really interesting when people try and, you know, particularly my party is green, the name is green, the color is green. So people assume that what that means is that the only thing that we care about is the environment, but actually, you know, people live within the environment. And so frequently also I find that when we're talking about climate change, we tend to do it from the perspective of, oh, we must care for the planet. The honest reality is, guys, in a millennia's time, the planet will be fine. it's all of us and the life supporting systems, the scientific fundamentals necessary for life on Earth as we know it, that is actually at risk here.
And the animals.
So I guess in terms of the day-to-day and the things that I'm trying to do through the likes of the Finance and Expenditure Committee in Parliament is we're currently in the midst of a climate adaptation inquiry, which is, politics. But also, I guess, from the current economic paradigm that we're working within is actually to try and get Treasury to recognise at least constructive liability for the 24 billion high level potential cost for us to meet our nationally determined contributions under the Paris Accord. Because at the very least, if we can speak the language of the status quo, then that provides us with some levers inside of that status quo.
But because Chloe is going to leave in 5 minutes, is there anyone here who has a question that you'd like to ask Chloe? And we can bring Eva will bring you the microphone. I think we here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lovely to see this intergenerational panel. Chloe, you said that the incentives don't exist right now for politicians across parties to work together. So how do we create these incentives? We don't have time.
Yeah.
So something's got to be done differently. What is it?
Don't leave politics to the politicians. My very basic thesis is that we currently have a situation where so many people feel disenfranchised and disenchanted by our political status quo because the system has not worked for them. What that means is that people disengage from politics. When you disengage, you get even less representation on the things that you care about and the people that you might want to be represented by. That lack of representation results in even less action, which results in even less engagement, even less representation, even less action. You can see that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, a real downward spiral. So in order to find a fuse breaker in that, I think it's really important that we reconceptualize what politics is and how Parliament is supposed to operate. So frequently in like my social media comments or in emails that I get from people will be complaining about how I, for example, am advocating for a fairer tax system and all you want to do is tax. And I'm like, bro, there are very few New Zealanders in this country who can afford the $20 billion that it costs for our superannuation bill every single year. Very few New Zealanders who can afford to build a school or a hospital or climate-ready infrastructure. That is why we form society, so that we can do these things together. So I think that one of the most important and critical things that any individual human being can do is see yourselves as part of a collective and participate in a bigger movement. And the kind of counterfactual of that, or some of the experiences that I had with some of the amazing rangatahi that were involved in the School Strike for Climate movement, I had these amazing young people who were so burnt out coming into my office and going, we had 60,000 people walking down Queen Street. Why did everything not change overnight? And I had to go, I'm really sorry, but that is an event. It's a tactic. It's not a sustained strategy. And I think that's part of realizing like this is actually the whakaaro that I put down at our Green AGM a few weeks ago, a speech that I've always wanted to give, which was that there is no point in being right if we are left clinging to our mountains of evidence when the last tree is cut down. And actually, unfortunately, I can hand on heart say that despite years of trying real hard to get people to care about the facts and the evidence, there's only so many people that will appeal to. What it all boils down to is relationships and trust. And that's the work that all of us who believe in this stuff have to do. We have to find ways to break down the barriers from people who we might otherwise call deniers or otherwise. And I think that's actually a real call out to all of us who believe in justice or otherwise as well, is that I tend to find that there is such a level of comfort in insulating ourselves by cancelling somebody for an indiscretion on the internet than there is to do the work, particularly the work that those who are confronted by the downward impacts of those quite negative and bigoted views, but instead of willing to do the work to actually help to change those views and build those relationships with people. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about conversations with values, to turn down the heat. We actually need to stop fighting at the pointy end of what our policy prescriptions are and go, what do we care about and what are we trying to achieve here, and hold ourselves accountable to that. I have to run. I'm really sorry.
You have to run.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate you taking time out to come down here, and we understand the pressures that you are under. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry. I know I talk fast. Please don't email me about it.
Okay. Well, I think, just before we come back to our panel here, we might bring you in, Noelene, from over there in Fiji. enduring some of, where you and all the Pacific Islands are enduring, well, you're on the front line of climate change, enduring the worst climate change impacts. I just wonder we've sort of focused here just on what New Zealand can be doing in the Pacific, particularly as our leaders are meeting in Tonga. What would you like to see New Zealand doing? Also just expand a bit on what you were talking about, what are the greatest impacts of climate change on women in the Pacific?
Thanks for that. I'll keep it short. I mean, one of the things is that we do have to listen better to each other about what we're trying to tell the world as Pacific women. So one of the things that we're doing better is our movement, I think, is very mature now, and we've had to be. So whether we're working on sexual and reproductive health and rights, we're also working on climate and disasters and biodiversity protection. We might be dealing with that. And it might be, for instance, around the issue of water and sanitation and menstrual health and those issues. So there's a maturing of the analysis and a way of speaking to the rest of the world that says, we can't keep talking about this as an abstract, because we still see that. I often get asked to speak on panels and I really come away feeling, to be honest, violated, because resilience is a word that's used a lot, right now. And it's in many kind of policy spaces. And to me, what it is almost like saying to the survivor or victim, get better at dealing with the bullying. Get better at being able to withstand what is violent. How else do you deal with the fact that fossil fuel companies won't end, that we won't stop the subsidies, that governments are allowing that to happen? And that neoliberal capitalism and the focus on profit is still what we are focused on, on doing. And why can't we have those frank conversations? If people from Australia and New Zealand are working within the Pacific space, we should be able to have these frank discussions about vuvale, about family, about being family, because there's a lot of policy rhetoric that doesn't translate into what we see in the negotiating rooms. And trust me, I've been in those negotiating rooms, and I know that when it gets to that point where we have very different economic masters to deal with, that it can become not so much family as dysfunctional family, or those who don't care about each other's best interests. So, be careful when we speak about policy focus. Resilience is really about being better at withstanding bullying. And then the next thing is, do we truly use the best tools that we have? We've violated 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. The scientists know it, the Stockholm Institute knows it, we know it, and yet we keep talking about these things as if they're technical. They're not. And what we're trying to do in our networks as women across the Pacific is to say, this is our knowledge too, and we want to be engaged in that. We don't just want to work on resilience and adaptation and loss and damage. We do want to work on mitigation. We need to bring down, and so that means that we have to talk about the issues of REDD+, and we have to talk about carbon trading, and we have to think about the ways that perhaps some of these things are false solutions. And where they work, I want to know what those specific instances are, those examples are. And where they don't work, we should be honest in that. So it's substantive work together as partners that is immediate, that is targeted, that is about both the urgent action right now, but also the slow onset work. And it's in every single part of our lives. When I get asked this, every single part of our lives it's affecting. And that means that women are working on all of these areas. We're planting a diversity of different crops within different gardens. Now there are many of our organizing groups that have 2 sets of planting so that they can do the work that is for the community. And women, trust me, their work on songo, on community work, is huge amounts. That's why we've got such high levels of unpaid care, domestic and communal work, because we're doing so much for the community and society. And then we have to increase the number of edible food and fruit plants. We have to increase the medicinal plants. More of our children are getting sick all the time now. And we have to locate gardens in different areas within our customary land. So we're trying to ensure that not all of our crops get destroyed if there's an extreme event or a cyclone or any of the other issues that we're dealing. Flooding and then drought are both happening within our communities. We have to look at storage. So Diva, for instance, has been quickly getting out water tanks to communities across Fiji because we're really worried about how we're going to do these issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights at the same time as we're experiencing all this change within our ecological environment. And how do we do the preservation of certain of our food staples? You know, what are the ways that we can take our traditional knowledge and make sure that we're using it? And not this rhetoric of it, but women are seriously doing the work to build that up. Harvesting rainwater, planting natural, indigenous plants along the coastlines, river and waterway banks. We built 3 bridges within a village in remote Kandavu. And we did that because children and women were walking across a coconut palm. And many aid organizations had been going there since 2016. We did that in 2 months. We built 1 bridge and the community built the other 2 bridges. So we know that there are more things that we can do together. We built 16 houses in cyclone proof to number 5 cyclones. We now have to look at 6 and 7 because we're worried about the intensity of the cyclones that we're facing. We are, relocating different kinds of crop cultivation inland. We're doing more work on solar. We're reversing the loss of indigenous knowledge about food production, about sovereignty of food, about the fact that we have these luxury water products. Why are we sending our water out into the world when we know already that that water is needed for communities in the next 20, 30, 50 years? And I'll end by saying how we know that is that as women, we have been working on feminist domestic policy. We have to get away from this this focus right now only on feminist foreign policy and really put it to work also in domestic policy. How do we reconfigure the state and society so that we are ready for what's coming? We are already seeing the social, the economic, the ecological problems, and we're seeing it from the local to the global. This is not just about technical. This is about everyday lives of everyone. You know it and we know it. So the solution has to be about the enabling conditions for women. It has to be about liberation. It has to be about ecological balance. And it has to be meaningfully about substantive justice and human rights for all bodies. And then ecosystems and other species and the planet. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Noelene, for really bringing it back into the everyday reality of what women and, well, everyone is experiencing in the Pacific and elsewhere. So thank you so much for that. Well, we're, as expected, running out of time, but we do need to, we are supposed to be talking right up here. We've had Noelene bringing us right back to the very daily, the impact on women's daily lives. But Jacqui, you're involved in these very high-level strategic discussions, COP29. And I presume you're off there in Azerbaijan shortly. So, what can we hope? Can we feel hopeful that something concrete that we will make real progress in COP29?
It's working. Green. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So I guess it's sort of tricky to discuss being hopeful that COPs deliver kind of progressive momentum on climate action. This is the 29th COP because there have been that many prior to it. That's how long these multilateral processes take to move forward. I mean, we work under a consensus basis and there are 195 parties to the Paris Agreement. each of them coming to the table with their own national objectives and priorities. And so reaching consensus is incredibly difficult, and it does take many, many years. However, we have reached essentially the point of implementation of the Paris Agreement now. We are no longer really negotiating the rules to design the agreement. We're in implementation mode, is what we like to say. So COP29, the big negotiating outcome, is what's called the new Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance, or NCQG for short. And this is sort of the discussion around the mobilization of finance that's required to deliver more climate action, both adaptation and mitigation action, for countries who require that mobilization of finance. And the discussion has to be creative beyond sort of the public purse, which is the traditional way that multilateralism is funded, to ensure that the private sector and philanthropy and other activities also contribute to climate action. What I'd also like to emphasize that what's occurring around the COP29 timeline is that this year, at the end of the year, all countries are submitting their first biennial transparency reports under the Paris Agreement. So this is the first time that countries are reporting on our progress towards our Paris Agreement commitment. So we'll get to see through this reporting how countries are tracking, how countries are doing. These reports are due at the end of the year, and then will be due every 2 years thereafter. And another meaningful milestone to note is that by February of next year, countries are expected to submit their next round of nationally determined contributions. So we're still in the process of implementing the first NDC that all countries are working towards, and in February, the second one is due. So it's kind of turning into a bit of a package deal, if you will, with climate finance on the table at the negotiations, the progress reporting due at the end of the year, and then by February, setting that next climate target. And we get to kind of see the Paris Agreement fully in implementation now. How are we actually doing collectively?
Well, that's fascinating to see that, up there at that level globally, and then to, having heard from Noelene about what's happening on the ground. But I think I can say for everyone here that we're absolutely delighted that you are there at COP as a woman representing New Zealand and in the negotiating table. So that's fantastic. Just quickly, because we're running out of time, looking at Jessica at the sort of, what the legal work can do. We've already heard the limits of where we're going politically at the moment. What can you do, legally to help to galvanize more effective action around climate change? And what would New Zealand, if New Zealand was a leader in climate change, what are the sorts of things that you think we should be doing?
Yeah, well, I'd start by saying that we actually have quite robust and strong legal frameworks in place. And I think it's important not to understate the importance of that we have, I think someone said it earlier, that the Climate Change Response Act and the existence of the Climate Change Commission and the reporting requirements, all of that is actually here by bipartisan consensus. And I think that's really important. Similarly, in the international realm, the fact that countries around the world have come together and signed the Paris Agreement and have agreed on a 1.5 degree target, I think it's really important and valuable. And at the end of the day, they are legal obligations. And the question now is we have set these targets, well, what do they look like when implemented on the ground? And that's the place that we're at the moment. And you see that playing out with the Climate Change Response Act. What does implementation look like? This is the first time we've had a new government in place while that framework is in place. And so, well, what does it look like when you have a new government that wants to take different approaches on policy, but still is signing up and is still maintaining those targets? And I think that that's a really important thing for the community, actually, to continue pushing the government on, making sure that we do keep those frameworks intact and really strong. I think in the international space, for New Zealand to be a leader, the NDC2 is a really important opportunity for New Zealand to uphold its commitment for what we call progressive NDC. So each NDC has to be more ambitious than the last. So that's a nationally determined contribution. So every country under the Paris Agreement has set a target that they say that they're committed to achieving. Our first target comes up and we're due to achieve it in 2030. So how could New Zealand be a leader? Actually achieving that target. And people are laughing, but actually it's a real question mark whether countries around the world, including New Zealand, will meet that target.
I
But
thought
you
we were
have,
about 50%.
we're
away.
we're
from it,
quite
even.
far. We're quite far, which is actually why the work that you do and your team is so important. We're very far away from meeting that. And you have to ask, well, what happens to the international agreement when countries like New Zealand don't meet it? And one of the funny things with international law is there's way fewer kind of accountability mechanisms under international law because it's all by consensus and countries agreeing and coming together. So if New Zealand is to show leadership, and we should and we can, we need to meet NDC 1, and then we also need to set a really ambitious, or at the very least, a progressive second nationally determined contribution and show the world that we're serious and maintain this collaboration that we have with the rest of the world in order to make sure that we tackle climate change.
Thanks so much for that. And Gill, just as we're winding up, you talked about this need for this cross-party consensus that we talked about with Chloe, or how difficult it is indeed to achieve. Have you any ideas about how we can try and build a cross-party consensus and, you know, long-term action? I mean, how are we going to achieve our 2030 goal?
I can't answer how we can achieve the 2030 goal, but I can say that years ago we established a cross-party group in Parliament on reproductive health and sexual behaviour, basically, except we called it population and something else. It's still going. It has turned opinion around the world. I have watched those parliamentarians who are cross-party travel together, and actually, for example, one minister in the Cook Islands said once, there were 4 women in the room and 28 men, and I was sitting there taking the notes, and he said, well, we can't possibly sign up to this equality for women in this clause. We can't agree to that clause. And I passed her a note, and she said to him, with respect, Minister, you have already signed it. And I hear you're doing quite well. So they exist all over the world, but they still exist here. Now, if you can get a cross-party group going on sexual and reproductive health, I reckon you can get them going on anything. Because surely, and we see it again now watching what has happened to women's rights in terms of their own lives, how challenging that is. So yes, we are very interested in trying to see if there is any interest in a cross-party group. Has to have representation of every parliamentary party, which is a bit nerve-wracking. And the chair must be from the current government, which could also be nerve-wracking. And apart from that, there's supposed to be one person, as I say, from each party. And together with that, we're really trying to look at meetings with MPs to find out someone in some party is certainly thinking something. Let's find out who really wants to make a difference on this issue and can see we're not talking about a bad bank balance, the IMF or something. We are talking about the future of our country, the future of our whānau, of our children and our grandchildren. I can't believe that in Parliament we only have people who don't care. No way do I believe that. And then at the same time, there's a couple of other things like influencers, like all of the wonderful people who are great at social media. We love a few of those. We'd love anyone to do anything, to be honest. And as well as that, then some of the older ones who might be willing, for example, to be involved in different ways of influencing and who would like to visit parliamentarians. So there's a lot of things we're working on. We're very small. We're still arguing over the name, so you can guess how well we're going to go if we can't agree on a name. But we're getting there, and I'd love to hear from anyone who's interested in joining us, because I have seen the cross-party movement work, and you have too, and you've been on it. And I know sometimes people think, well, they're just there to be noticed and so on, but they have changed the law here and internationally, and continue to and still exist.
And actually, as I said, James Shaw worked for years. In fact, a lot of people were, you know, why is it taking so long to get this climate commission established? and he beavered away for years. He was absolutely determined to get cross-party agreement, buy-in, locked in. And he got it locked in, and that's one of the only things that has not been dismantled, because it was locked in through that cross-party consensus. So, you know, it does seem to me, and actually what Chloe was saying though, so it's really up to the community. We shouldn't just be looking at the Parliament on the Hill. We need to be looking at what all of us can do to hold those parliamentarians to account. But
They all
anyway,
want to get re-elected.
they want to be re-elected. This is true. And unfortunately, that's what happened in the British election. The issues of inflation, economic issues, health, the collapse of the health system, those became the priority, those immediate issues, rather than the longer term issue of climate change. Anyway, I think that Eva is telling me we need to, unfortunately, we have to wrap up, and there isn't time for the questions that we hoped might come from the floor. So I think really, Eva, I think you want to talk about a proposed, I think you're going to hold another webinar. But thank you so much for being such a fantastic audience, for so many of you turning up. Noelene, thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you there in Fiji, contributing to our discussions and in a very passionate way. Thanks so much to all of you speakers. I think you've been a magnificent panel, and Eva just wants to wrap it up.
So just a big round of applause for everyone, for our speakers. Thank you so much. I wanted to let you know that we've got another event organised for the 4th of December. So we want to continue, like, not just have a one-off event, but to like start getting some momentum going. So the 4th of December event, we've already got 3 speakers confirmed. We've got Megan Woods, who's the climate spokesperson for Labour. We've got the head of the Climate Change Commission, and we have someone from the school climate strike, named to be determined, but thank you for agreeing to that. So we will email you details about how to register for that event closer to the time. But yes, thank you to our speakers, and we've just got a small gift as well.
And if anyone wants to join up with Gill, or indeed, I should add that the National Council of Women has a very active, the National Council of Women also has a very active climate change action hub. So we would be absolutely delighted if any of you were interested in participating in that as well. So with that, thank you so much. And we'll wrap the evening up. Thank you.
Thank you.